Good morning, internet. Welcome to the Freddie and Paul show. I just did the Freddie and Paul show with Freddie. I just posted it. It was so Freddie and I had to run an errand, and we he said, "Oh, I watched your video yesterday." I thought, "What video did he watch?" Uh, and he couldn't quite describe it. I said, "The one with Peugeot and Weinstein?" "Oh, yeah, that one." What'd you think of it? He had a bunch of ideas. So then when we did the Freddie and Paul show, we had, of course, the sports report. We went through a drive-through because he missed breakfast at the place that he lives because we were running the errand. So we went through McDonald's drive-through, and he got a fancy coffee, which he always likes. And then he had thoughts about the show. The first thing was, is Weinstein the same as Feinstein? Which just cracked me up. And so he had a bunch of questions. So if you're curious about that, they're on the Freddie and Paul show that I just released a few minutes before getting here to church. And Roger and Scott were outside working on the fence, and Rick was here all set up. We're working on security cameras because we're going to put up some security cameras because the gate's going to be automatic. And what's of course going to happen is people are going to come up to the gate, and then they're going to call me and say, "Pastor Paul, I need to get into church and the gate's closed." So then it's like, okay, I got to open the gate. So I'll be able to open the gate from home. And then, "Pastor Paul, I forgot my alarm code." So then I got to disarm the alarm. I mean, there's just a lot of little things that goes on with a church like that. So anyway, so here for the question and answer. And Charlie Brown, we're up to questions from April 29. We'll just keep marching through them. Rousseau, Goethe, Nietzsche, Kant, all of these stellar European thinkers on meaning crisis seem to have had serious issues with the opposite sex. Both Rousseau and Goethe had revelations in their thinking due to sexual interactions in Italy. That's interesting. Foucault is another story with his own sexuality. That's to say the least. Why is the meaning crisis essentially based on men unable to accept monogamous matrimony? Monogamous isn't necessarily easy for our desires. We value novelty. Men do. I mean, just watch Peterson and Buss talk about some of those issues. Church fathers, of course, talked about epithumia, these over desires. Christian sexuality has always been an ambitious aspiration. And the fact that to one degree or another, at a variety of points in time, it was normalized on a mass level is an achievement. It's an achievement of Christendom. But now, especially, and many people have pointed this out, it's one thing to be monogamous for 5 or 10 or 15 years. It's even more strenuous in some ways to be monogamous for 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. Although probably years 40 through 70, it gets easier. So it's a and this is not new. But when Jesus has his little chat with the disciples about marriage and divorce, they basically say, well, then who can marry? So none of this is new. And we're just kind of talking from the man's side of things. From the woman's side of things, there's all sorts of other issues that crop up. So if you look at my 3+ hour video on same-sex marriage and Protestantism, I think in fact what is revealed to us is the peak of human sexuality. It's the goal. It's what we were made for. But the fact that people struggle to attain and achieve it should come as no surprise to anyone who is a man or a woman. So, and it goes far beyond just the sexual aspect of the relationship. It goes to two broken human beings trying to get on the same page and live together and love each other and serve each other. It's a tremendously challenging thing to be married. And the fact that for some people it comes relatively easily is a gift from God. So it shouldn't be any surprise that this is challenging and people struggle with it. And it goes far beyond the meaning crisis. So I've let out a few teasers with my conversation with Rod Hare. And those of you who have been around the local meetup will recognize Rod. Rod's been to a number of our local events. I mean, very quickly, Rod and I formed a relationship. We had Whitensville in common, and we became friends, and we've spoken, on and off now throughout the years. This is the first time he's really sort of been on the channel as such. But he and I talk a little bit in that talk about his point, which is one of the things that has really broken down is men and women finding each other, figuring each other out. And I think part of this is just because, see, I don't want to say life is more challenging for us, because in some ways it's easier. But with our increase in power and choice and options, having men and women live together in a committed monogamous relationship, it's a challenge. So yeah, and it's also, and I have Catherine Wilson in the back of my mind, because she always checks me on this point and did so in the comment section. It's also a glory, but that's the nature of aspiration. One of the things one of the new innovations in Peterson's second wave was when he is connecting aspiration with worship and revelation and transformation, because I think we have to do a lot more thinking about that. Christian, I'm with C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity on the Christian vision for human sexuality is demanding and strenuous, but I think it's right. That is the best. And it's remarkable when, someone like Brett and Heather Hying, talk about that. Their situation, as I don't know if I'll have time to make another commentary video for them for Monday this afternoon. Since Holy Week, I've just been slammed for time, and summer looks even more challenging with all the trips and things that are going on. But it's quite remarkable that Brett and Heather, in many ways, hold up monogamy as something aspirational. It speaks to the deep way in which the Bible has penetrated the West, even for people who are skeptical of it. Plus the fact that it's a little uncomfortable for Brett, probably, if he wants to throw monogamy under the bus if he's doing a podcast with his wife. So there's that too. Yeah, it should come as no surprise that human beings struggle in the realm of sexuality, because our desires run against our so people are always having to deal with short-term and long-term. That's one way to think about it. Short-term, our desires tend to lead us to, a friend who used to go to the church, moved across country, just dropped in yesterday when I was having my conversation with Rod, and so we went out to lunch, because I'm his real life pastor, even though he moved to New Jersey, and he brought me a bunch of cookies, And I mentioned to my council last night on the council meeting, me having a bag of cookies in my office is a very dangerous thing, because I tend to sit here and I'm thinking about my sermon and I'm thinking about my videos and I'm thinking about the church and I'm, studying the Bible. I'm doing all these things. But when there are cookies at hand, the hand and the mouth just keep working together. And, there's a degree of that with sexuality too, with people. There are levels of us that just grab towards immediate satisfaction, and other levels of us say, well, probably wouldn't be a good thing, Paul, if you just eat all those cookies this afternoon in your office. It's probably not a good thing, and I could kind of handle it no problem when I was 21, and I could do it now and not have any serious consequences. But this spare tire around my middle is saying that I need to have a much more disciplined long-term strategy with respect to my appetites, and appetites even as literal as these cookies. So, yeah, there's almost no puzzle as deep within human history as there is the working together between men and women for their mutual satisfaction, for the glory of God and the blessings of the earth. It's just the way it is. Let's see. We got all men in the no. We've got at least one woman in the group today. Any comments on that from the Bridges of Meaning PVK question ins recorded voice chat? Anybody got something they want to say about it? I guess not. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Probably best that we all keep our mouths shut. All right. Hey, Paul. It's say Marvin, 23-year-old from New Zealand. If you remember, I think I remember that talk. Since we've talked, I seem to have integrated my shadow to a great degree. I can tell because when I commit sin, I don't feel the shame that would put me in cycle and cause me to commit even greater sins. I think this comes from growing up in a Protestant church. I would say a bunch of Catholics might disagree with that, because I've heard ample Protestants and Catholics talking about, um, how should I say it, unhelpful relationships with sin and guilt, because everyone is so afraid to admit that they messed up that they start lying to each other and even themselves. I was caught up in this too. I think it's because there's such a high standard given to you once you get saved, whatever that means. So now when I sin, yes, I know it's wrong and I will never defend sin, but I just don't lie when I do. And it seems to weed out people in my life that have limited love for me. What are your thoughts on this? Am I getting to someone good here? Because I've been honestly felt so free lately because of this. I think this is a tremendous point. So let's talk about the Protestant Catholic dynamic a little bit first. In terms of Luther's Reformation story, part of his liberation came because his conscience was so tender. And I'm not even sure that's quite the right way. Even his confessors were critical of his, he would be confessing every tiny little sin. And I think this illustrates a not uncommon thing, and I don't think it's by no means exclusively the domain of Protestants, that there's a cycle in which your guilt can dive you deeper into sin. People have talked about this with respect to, let's say, porn addiction, that someone they'll just screw up their will to no longer look at porn, and then they stumble and fall, and then they feel horrible about themselves because of the transgression, and then they self-soothe with porn, which of course sets the whole thing up, and they cycle, 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 cycle. It's not an unusual thing. So there's an irony in there that what has to interrupt the cycle is a sense of, well, sense of what? Sense of forgiveness. And this is very difficult because some people rush in and say, well, if you in some people's minds, the only way to prevent sin is feelings of guilt and shame. Now, it is true that feeling guilt and shame and anticipating feeling guilt and shame can be used as a way to not sin. But as I said before, you can also have a cycle in which guilt and shame bring you to more sin. Now, part of what you're commenting on here is also the one of the things that my systematics professor who I've spoken about before, Neil Plantinga, wrote a book, Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, a breviary of sin. It's a great little book. There are many biblical images of sin. One of the images is sin is a trap that no matter what we do, we can't seem to get out of. And what I'm talking about here are all these really horrible little traps of sin. One of the traps of sin is self-righteousness, that maybe you've been successful in avoiding particular transgressions, and so then suddenly you become proud, self-sufficient, boastful about your ability to avoid particular transgressions, let's say, that the community is highly conscious of. Let's say it's something like theft. You don't shoplift, you don't steal, you don't rob banks, you don't steal cars. Well, good for you. Maybe it's adultery. You've never slept with any other woman other than your wife. Now, I think part of what goes on in the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus addresses this, because it can be, if you become proud of yourself for avoiding certain classes of sin that almost every society will recognize, that pride itself easily becomes sinful. And there's Flannery O'Connor had a great line in one of her stories about a particular character, which was basically a guy who figured he wouldn't need Jesus if he could avoid sin. And in some ways, it's the story of the rich young ruler that Jesus talks to. And when we talk about sin, we're always talking about two dynamics. One dynamic is a status that we cannot achieve, and that is sinlessness. Another dynamic are particular acts which we should not transgress. So sometimes we talk about one as sin and the other as sins. And every society will have sins which good people can avoid. I don't steal my neighbor's car. I don't commit adultery with my neighbor's wife. I don't lie in court about my neighbor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And moral systems for a very long time have noted that on one level, that's wonderful. I am glad you don't steal your neighbor's car or commit adultery with your neighbor's wife or commit perjury against your neighbor's name. I'm glad you don't do those things. But if you think you are avoiding sin altogether by just avoiding these transgressions, that's also too simplistic. Okay. So, what happens in a religious community, as you've talked about, is that there is encouragement, there is sort of reputational maintenance, and there is checking on each other to meet community standards. So we do this in church. So if you, and Rod and I talked about this, I haven't released the whole Rod video, maybe I'll do that on Monday. If you believe all the correct things, you can check off the boxes on the I believe column. And if you don't steal your neighbor's car or sleep with your neighbor's wife or perjure yourself in court, you can be an elder or a deacon or a pastor in the church. There you go. Bingo. You've arrived. You've achieved. And once you've achieved a certain status in a community, we human beings pay an enormous amount of attention to status. And we are always playing these status games, and we all know it. We don't like to admit it, especially in an egalitarian culture like ours. Other cultures in the world and other cultures throughout time have been much more overt about their status and their rank. But we tend to especially like to say, we're all in good graces. We're all good people. Now, there's something really good about that, because if everybody sort of knows the rules and everybody knows what they should do, then there's a fair amount of community cohesion to keep to the rules. And that encourages and reinforces, and in many ways helps keep people on the straight and narrow. That's a good thing. However, even if you can avoid kind of the obvious overt things like stealing your neighbor's car and sleeping with your neighbor's wife and perjuring, perjuring yourself in court against your neighbor's good name, there are other layers of sin underneath the surface. Maybe in your church, there's no moral problem against drinking. Maybe you drink too much, but you do it quietly. And, you show up for work on time and everything looks good. Maybe life at home there's a lot of arguing, and there's a lot of bickering, and there's a lot of yelling. But when you show up in church, well, you're not gonna do like Johnny Depp and Amber Heard and air each other's dirty laundry in front of the whole world, even if the whole world wouldn't really care that much. You're when you show up for church, you're going to be dressed up nice and you're going to look good and you're going to play nice. And so then you get this two-level life of, and Jesus, of course, talked about this a lot, hypocrisy. And this is a well-known thing too. And regularly you can find people talking about the fact that, everybody in that church looks good and they all say the right thing. And, on one level, everybody's behaving well, but underneath the surface, stuff is going on. They're gossiping about each other. They're complaining about each other. They're speaking poorly of each other. There's factioning. There's all this stuff going on under the surface. And, well, so then suddenly you have a hypocrisy problem in your church. And what you described here in terms of you now being honest with people in your church about not only the obvious overt sins sort of above the waterline, but some of the quieter stuff below the waterline. Well, you've just really done a lot probably to address the hypocrisy thing. And that's an improvement. And I think you're dead on right about this. And so for many people, and this is particularly true, let's say, and Chad will probably correct me if I'm wrong, but in groups like AA, when people, let's say, who have, maybe they've been keeping up appearances, they've been making good money at work, they've got a lovely wife that, think about Mad Men, that TV show, Don Draper looks good, his wife is beautiful, he's got a great job, but everybody knows that beneath the surface, people are sleeping with the office staff, they're drinking too much, they're playing around with drugs, et cetera, but they're keeping up appearances. So suddenly you've got a situation like in AA groups when someone will go up and they'll say, I achieved things in my community. I was a member of the Rotary. I um, kept my lawn in good order. Everybody thought things were good, but at home I was drinking, and finally I couldn't take it anymore, and the wife didn't want to live with me anymore, et cetera, et cetera. And so now finally I hit bottom, at least a bottom for me, and now I'm here to in this 12-step program. It's Alcoholics Anonymous. So I can tell you all my dirty secrets and dirty laundry, and everybody in the room understands. And the beautiful thing about a 12-step program is you rip that hypocrisy off, or at least a level of it off, and everybody gets to experience confession and things are clean. And that's wonderful. And it's so often so much healthier than a system of hypocrisy. And so what has happened often in churches, then people are like, I want to go to a church where there's no hypocrisy. And so what is developed in some church traditions is then testimony time. So and so gets up on the stage and says, kind of does what you do in AA, but they do it in front of church. But then in the end, of course, Jesus came and saved me, and now I don't drink anymore. I don't have problems with porn anymore. I'm not a womanizer anymore. I don't cheat people selling used cars anymore, et cetera, et cetera. And everybody feels good about it. And so you have this redemption story, and it's very powerful. And again, that's a wonderful thing. But then after a while, even that becomes a liturgy, and people listen to now the newly unveiled hypocrite who has embraced his hypocrisy and say, gosh, all these stories sound alike. And even the former hypocrite is now deriving a degree of self-righteousness and self-satisfaction by virtue of the community affirmation of their confession of sin. And so I've watched churches go through these cycles where first there's a sense of hypocrisy and everybody's keeping up appearances. And then there's usually some big exposure and something that was unseen gets seen. And then there's a moment of confession and renewal. And then everyone's about transparency. But then the community also needs a degree of above and below the waterline. Because let's say every single sermon in church, the pastor is up there confessing his sins. And there's the pastor. And, well, you know what? Now maybe he's not really, sleeping with his neighbor's wife, but he's up there in the pulpit saying, yeah, I looked at Betty next door and she was washing the car and I lusted in my heart. Okay, well, how's that really going to go in the church? And the pastor's up there and talking about, and next week, maybe, Brenda wore yoga pants to the supermarket, and, Pastor Bob is talking about, yeah, I saw Brenda in the supermarket in those yoga pants and she looked good and I lusted in my heart. After a while, everybody at church is to the point of like, Pastor Bob, we understand you're a man. And we get the fact that you shouldn't lust in your heart, but we don't really need to hear about it every week. In fact, you talking about Betty washing her car and Brenda in the supermarket in the yoga pants, maybe we should spend more time just studying the Bible or hearing a normal sermon instead of making the pulpit your confessional. How about that? So these things tend to go in cycles. And all of this to say that sin is, I really should read more Alcoholics Anonymous stuff, because they've gotten a lot of this stuff down into some really catchy mimetic language, usually about alcohol, that alcohol is, because my alcoholic friends would tell me these little memes, and I just thought they were incredibly apt and also applicable to all sorts of other sins. In other words, You can sin by avoiding sin. You can sin by confessing sin. And sin is a is an adversary that is too great for us, which means in Christian theology, why, you can read this in the Heidelberg Catechism, Jesus needs to be both man and God, because he needs to be man, because he needs to be able to identify and wrestle with exactly what we do, and he needs to be God because he needs to be an adversary that we are unable to beat. And so what then develops in the Christian church is then this liturgy that Jacob spoke out quite passionately against last week, that here, Christ defeats sin and death for us because we cannot. Now, psychologically, that then can slip into sort of an easy salvationism where it doesn't matter what I do or don't do because Jesus has saved me from my sin. And if I can't really beat sin, then I'm not responsible for sin, and on and on and on and on. If you live in church long enough and you watch all of these things long enough, you see these patterns. And for almost every answer and solution we come up with, there's a moral fault that gets exposed by the solution, and there's a way in which the answer is shown to be insufficient, which is part of the reason why I remain a Protestant who asserts that we are saved by grace through faith, not because of works, lest anyone should boast. That finally it is Christ who rescues us, because if it is up to me to rescue myself, I won't get it done. And that then gets into all kinds of conversations about sin as community standard and all of these types of things. And so what you're talking about, I think here is an achievement, and it's a wonderful one. If you have around you a Christian community, and often you can't have too many people. It's usually just need either a priest that you can confess to, or if you're a Protestant, good brothers and sisters in Christ that you can be transparent with, that you can talk about your sin, that you can confess your sin, that you can get godly advice. Praise God. And I completely agree with what you've said here in terms of now, because you can be transparent about your sin, you have a degree of liberation where you don't have to keep up appearances. But there will be other places in which it's probably not appropriate to walk into church and say, "Oh, there's Betty. Oh, Betty, that dress. I'm lusting after you right now. I confess in the name of Jesus that I'm lusting after you right now." Don't do that. Because Betty's husband isn't going to like it. Betty's kids are going to listen to this and say, "What is going on?" Your wife, if you're married, will say, your things are just going to go crazy if you start playing these kinds of games. And I've seen people try to play these games and they don't go well. In other words, this whole thing of community standards, this whole facade that tends to create hypocrisies. Yeah, there are problems to it, but yeah, there are also reasons for it. The entire world does not need to know about every little lust of your heart, or every little greedy desire, or every little lapse in willpower about chocolate chip cookies that come into your office. Maybe I've got this spare tire around my belly because I have a moral deficiency in resisting chocolate chip cookies. Maybe I've got it just by virtue of my genetics. Maybe I've got it by virtue of my lifestyle. Maybe I've got it by virtue of the kinds of chemicals that tend to be in the American diet, as opposed to, let's say, an English diet, which makes America such fatties. On and on and on and on and on. So I think what you're talking about here is you are definitely onto something good, because you are realizing that there is power in confession. And we all need people that we can be transparent with and say, "You know what? I got this in my life and I need to confess it, and I need I need encouragement from someone who is going to be the right person. It's also the case that there are certain sins that you can confess to some people and not other people by virtue of the relationship. So Betty walks into church with that hot dress, and you go up to Betty and say, "Oh, Betty, I'm really lusting after you right now. Jesus, forgive me, Betty. I mean, anybody looking at that is saying, now, are you confessing your sins, or are you, in fact, pursuing sin with Betty? And are you, giving her trouble?" I mean, on and on and on and on and on and on and on these things go. So maybe this whole answer is just craziness for many of you, but that's part of the reason why when I go into a church and people are like, there are sins beneath the surface here that people aren't talking about. I totally believe that. There's hypocrisy here that needs to get exposed. Probably. This is a church where everybody just keeps telling all of their dirt to everyone, and you know what? It's making more dirt. Yeah, I believe that too. We try all sorts of ways to defeat sin, and we can't. There are some sins we can sort of keep defeated or at least boxed up, and that's a really good thing. But sin all the way down, I've seen lots of people try lots of different things, and we are natural born sinners, and sin is really good at undermining our attempts at being victorious over it. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Doesn't mean we shouldn't hold each other accountable. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have institutions and churches that help us, and friendships that help us as we go through life become better and better. But this is the way it is. So now, having said all that, I'm sure somebody in the comments, I'm sure somebody in the room has something they want to say about this. Wow. Nothing. You have anything you want to say about that, Rick? Rick says no. All right. Are our garments of skin our physical ape bodies? No. I don't think so Jonathan Peugeot is obviously using garments of skin metaphorically, referring to these garments of skin that the Lord gives Adam and Eve after their fall. I think if we would go to thinking along these lines, we would probably start slipping into more of a Gnostic heresy, by which our materiality is somehow not good in the way that it is declared good in Genesis chapter 1. So, but the garments of skin metaphor is a very interesting one. So, what are your thoughts on A Course in Miracles? So on Twitter this morning, I had another very interesting conversation this week with a guy out of Bristol, UK, and it'll come up. And I can probably say his name, Paul Baker. He's an older chap. And we had a lovely conversation. Such an interesting guy. And I made a little clip, maybe I'll post it a little bit later today, where he tells the story of his father. So he and his father went to Eton. And if you know anything about these, they're called public schools in the UK, even though they're more like private schools in the US. These are the kinds of schools that C.S. Lewis hated. But Eton is like one of the top prep schools in England. You can see, I think it's the same school that Charles went to. So the royal family sends their children there. And of course, in The Crown, you have these stories of poor, miserable Charles at Eton, and a bunch of the stuff that C.S. Lewis complains about. This guy talked about briefly. But so his father went to Eton, and he was just one of the best squash players at Eton, but he was having knee trouble. And he was having knee trouble, and there was like somebody really high up in Christian Science, and at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, for a lot of interesting cultural reasons, Christian Science was hugely popular. And Christian Science, I don't know a lot about the movement. I'm really curious about it because there was a man at Living Stones a number of years ago who was all covered with tattoos. His name was Brandon. He's dead now. And his wife was dead now. I married him in his wife's summer. Brandon was a member of all the different CRCs in Sacramento eventually, one after the other. He was covered in head to toe in tattoos. He had childhood diabetes, and he grew up in the Christian Science church, which meant that they completely rejected modern medicine and trusted Jesus to heal them. And Brandon was never healed of his childhood diabetes, and his untreated childhood diabetes wreaked havoc in his body, as we know it does. He needed insulin because his body didn't produce any insulin. And finally, I mean, that wreaked havoc in his parents' lives. Finally, they left the Christian Science faith and got him insulin and got him medical treatment. But the consequence of him never having had insulin as a child set him up for all sorts of medical things that bothered him his whole life long. And he was a musician, and he became a drug user and an alcoholic, and his entire body was covered with tats. And then he became a Christian, and he was on disability. He was blind often. I mean, he finally died in his 40s, and he called me. I was on vacation, so unfortunately I didn't get a chance to talk to him. One day when his wife went to work, he could feel himself dying. He wrote on his chest, DNR, do not resuscitate, a big marker on his chest, and he barricaded himself in his room, and he tried to call up a bunch of friends, including myself, who was one of the last pastors that he had, and to say his goodbyes, and he passed away. And so that's a deep impression of Christian Science on me. Now, this individual that I talked to, his father was a top squash player who was having these knee troubles and at Eton, and he couldn't compete. And so he talked to one of the chief Christian Science guys for 20 minutes on the phone. After that, he never had knee troubles again. Like, wow. I've been talking about miracles in my Sunday sermons. There's a miracle. And as Paul said, in those early days of Christian Science, there were all these attested miracles, which have all sort of fallen away. And my friend Brandon, when he was a kid, when he couldn't get insulin, he would say to people in his church, if you're allowed to wear glasses, why can't I get insulin? In other words, if you're relying on the power of Jesus for miracles, why don't you have Jesus heal your bad eyesight? And, shut up, kid. And so, it's a fascinating conversation I had with Paul Baker. And so when I look today at places like Bethel, and when I read some of the things that Bill Johnson says from Bethel and Redding, now, on one hand, I want to be really careful here because they're Christians. I'm not going to speak ill of them. Now, their approach to miracles, I think, is deficient because I don't think they actually get the picture right. Because basically what they say, and many groups have said this, going all the way back to Christian Science, and I'm sure before that, I'm sure we've had people who have worked this line all the way back to the early church, that if you're really doing Christianity right, you won't have any health problems. No, no, no. I don't think it's true. And it's a cousin of prosperity gospel where if you're really doing Christianity right, then your bank account will be full and your wife will be fertile and your fields will produce. Now you can say, hey, read the end of Deuteronomy. You can say, hey, look at the patriarchs. But you also have to look at the book of Job. And the book of Job basically says, it's not that simple. When Job lost his family and his wealth and his health, it wasn't because Job had sinned. So, and I think that truth carries on through Jesus and it goes all the way right to the cross. Because basically, the book of Deuteronomy, someone who is hanging on a tree is God forsaken. That's sort of, again, a sort of a karmic idea. But we don't just have the book of Deuteronomy. We have other books in the Bible. And when Jesus is crucified, the point that's made is partly the book of Job, because the book of Job is set up to say, here's the world's best man, and look at what he suffered. Is karma simply the answer to the world? The Bible says no. Now, is it also true that what you sow, you shall reap? Yeah. So, as the Methodists, as John Wesley had pointed out, as many have pointed out, many Christian people become healthy, wealthy, and wise because they obey the commandments, they follow God, and all of that often produces wealth and happiness and good things. But we also live in the age of decay, where our bodies break down, where the wages of sin is death. And it's also the case that, and this is part of what Christianity alters, because the story of Jesus is one of, and this is something that Jordan Peterson gets right, embracing the meaningful, challenging suffering. So Jesus came to this world to suffer, but he does so voluntarily. In other words, when Christ embraces his incarnation, he is embracing our suffering. And when Christ embraces his mission in the world, he is embracing the suffering. And he does so purposefully and intentionally and meaningfully. And the way that the story is told and set up and the entire thing happens, Peugeot is exactly right. It's just amazing how Jesus fills the hierarchy, how Jesus becomes all in all. It's amazing how the story goes. Because on one hand, the truth that obedience is rewarded is true. And it's proved by Jesus. Now you might say, well, it's a little hard to say it's proved by Jesus because isn't he crucified? Yeah, but he's also raised. But if you say, well, I'm skeptical about the resurrection. Well, there goes your argument about obedience is rewarded. Oh, but maybe an afterlife. Okay, but Christianity has that too. So in many ways, Christianity, there's a lot of the conversations and questions that many other religions have been wrestling with. Christianity sort of comes in and says, karma, I'll take that. Sowing and reaping, I'll take that. The unanswered questions about do good and receive a horrible end, Christianity says, I'll take that. I'll take all of these pieces and I'm going to draw them into the story of Jesus, and I'm going to make sense of them, but not a totalizing sense that leaves no loose ends, because then on the outside of that, there will also be room for mystery and faith and meaning and continued growth further up and further in. And so whether it's Christian Science at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, or it's A Course in Miracles that basically says if Christians are really doing it right, then there'll be no illness among us. Now, maybe that's not what they're saying, and if not, I certainly take this back. I've read a couple of Bill Johnson's books. I think it's more the case that God does do miracles, and God gets to pick and choose, and he gives miracles and reprieves to whomever he wants for his own will and for his own glory, and we will never figure it out. It's also the case that in some of his best servants, he brings them to suffer. I think that's true of Israel and the story of Israel. I think that's part of the story of Israel, that Israel is elect and Christ is elect, and the election of Israel and the election of Christ, they're deeply connected. Israel was chosen to suffer for the sake of the world. Abraham was chosen to suffer. What do you mean Abraham was chosen to suffer? Hey, Abraham, I'm going to promise you your life's desire. I'm going to give it to you, and I'm going to give it to you freely. You're not going to achieve it. I'm going to give it to you. I am going to ask you to live up to the faith that I set before you, but I'm going to give it to you. Yes, give it to me. I want a son. I want a lineage. I want to be a great nation. Absolutely, Abraham, I'm going to give it to you. Years go by. Will you bless my servant? No, not your servant. Will it be through Lot? Nope, not through Lot. Gosh, not getting any younger. Hey, how about Hagar and Ishmael? Nope, I will bless them, but that's not what I'm talking about. Sarah, your wife, will have a son. You've got to be out of your mind. Abraham's an old man. Sarah's an old woman. We know biology. Why do you laugh? Isaac is born. Let's name him Laughter. God has finally come through for us. Take your son, your only son, to the mountain that I will show you. It's right there. That's where the story starts. And it goes all the way through Jesus. And so, on one hand, the premise that if we had more faith, if we were more faithful, would there be more miracles? Probably. I don't doubt that. But I think we would also continue to bear witness to the cruciform Christ. Because, as I've been mentioning in my sermons for the last few weeks, and I think this is borne witness to in Christ, God does some things through suffering within the age of decay, within this fallen world, that can be done no other way sometimes. And by that suffering, he actually accomplishes a greater glory that could have been done in a more straightforward, rational, miraculous way. And that is sometimes a bigger, deeper miracle still. It's one thing for God to look at someone who is, let's say, they're crippled. And maybe they go to Bill Johnson's church, they're doing courses in miracles, and his crippled legs are healed, and he goes off and he sets a world record in, the quarter mile or something. We'd say, wow, what a miracle. Maybe it would be a greater miracle for that cripple to live his whole life bearing under that infirmity, learning to love each other, blessing others, and changing a generation of people because of that infirmity, which is the greater miracle. And this, again, is why I push back on this idea of when modernity gets a hold of a miracle, it wants to say, all right, we're going to put it into a test tube. And once we can really find one, the amazing Randy is going to give $1 million. Well, you've just sort of put miracle in a little test tube shaped box. The life of St. Francis. There's a miracle. And you say, well, yeah, there's miracles that happen. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a big miracle. How about the fact that we survived the Cold War? Well, there's a miracle. Well, I don't think laws of physics were violated. Yeah, that's kind of the internet nerd. I don't think the laws of physics were violated by our ability to avoid nuclear annihilation during the Cold War. Therefore, it's not a miracle. Yeah, but we use that word pretty broadly, don't we? So, I'm not going to criticize anybody that says, I'm going to really study the Bible because I really want to be a more faithful Christian, and I want Jesus to do miracles through me. That's a worthwhile thing to pursue. But Christian Science was they put it right out front. We're going to take the stuff of the Bible and we're going to turn it into a science, and we're going to that's taking something that belongs in the domain of the spirit of finesse and trying to force it into the spirit of geometry. And I've seen a lot of people try that, and usually things get broken. That's in some ways the entire thing that Paul Kingsnorth and others are complaining about. The world, the natural order is not a mystery to be dissected and vivisected. The natural order is our sister. And she's full of glory and she should be respected. And the same thing is certainly true of miracles. And over time, these efforts are tried and started many, many different times and places, and they almost always end the same, which is with kind of where's Christian Science today? My friend Brandon, his life was a miracle, but not because there was any point in his life that he didn't need insulin. Miracles followed that guy. I love that guy. We had fun. He taught me a lot about trusting in God, but he always needed insulin. That's my answer. Anybody have anything they want to say about that from the Bridges of Meaning Discord room?
Hey, Paul, as the personal representative of all heresies, can I talk a little bit about Christian Science?
Yes. You know something about it?
Yeah. So Christian Science is actually way more different than people realize. It's not just like they really extra believe that God can do miracles like a charismatic church might. They actually think that the material world is an illusion, and that your mind is actually in charge of everything, and that when you have a disease, it's because you're thinking wrongly and you're projecting that into the illusion of materiality. And the way to wake up from that is to realize that the material world is an illusion. It's sort of like in The Matrix when Neo goes to the Oracle, right? And there's the boy bending the spoons. And then, like, Neil's like, how are you bending the spoons? And the boy's like, the key is that there is no spoon. Like, so here's a quote from Christian Science. All healing is a metaphysical process. That means there is no person to be healed, no material body, no patient, no matter, no illness, no one to heal. Yada, yada, yada. This is what the practitioner must be clear about. So it's actually very, very different from like a charismatic trying to, kind of really hyper influence God. It's that there is nothing wrong with you. You're just thinking that there is. Wow. It's very weird.
Amen.
Well, it's not very weird. It's not that. It's you can get there from Sam Harris.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of Buddhist, actually.
Yeah, it is.
Suffering is an illusion. Existence is an illusion. Just kind of retreat into your mind. And I think that Christian Science was really good at kind of invoking self-induced placebo effects at its heyday. And some diseases are more influenceable by placebo than others. Diabetes is not very influenceable by placebo, for instance, nor is bad eyesight. But especially psychosomatic or autoimmune diseases are more susceptible to that sort of thing. And something like 80% of the membership of Christian Science was women, because women tend to suffer from those sorts of diseases at a higher rate and probably can have a placebo-induced, treatment more often than diseases that men have. So it's way different than what people think it is. It's not just Christians who extra believe in miracles. It's something radically other than that.
Wow. Thank you, Sam. That's fascinating. So
and it arose in Boston at the same time that all the other things were. It's like the T in moralistic therapeutic deism, right?
Yeah.
The moralistic comes from the Calvinists, the T comes from the Christian Science, and the D comes from the Unitarians.
Wow. See why it's good to have Sam around? That's awesome, Sam. I wish I knew that before, but glad I know it now. That's super helpful. Very interesting.
Hey Paul, what's that bit you were just talking about where they're like, it doesn't affect the physics of matter or something? What was that you said?
I don't know.
Yeah, like the internet nerds, they're like, oh, it doesn't affect the physics of matter or whatever. Never.
Oh, it's just it'll be the way that people approach miracles from a materialist perspective. A miracle is a violation of the law of physics, something like that.
Oh, but
and so,
yeah, so
there is a magician out there named the Amazing Randy that he was also, one of the new atheists, and he basically had $1 million prize that he would give for someone who could, demonstrate a miracle to him. And he would very proudly noted how he's not given away the $1 million yet. And I could say, I'm going to give $1 million for someone who shows me a cat that can fetch. And then, maybe it's not too hard to teach a cat to fetch. And bring me your cat that fetches. Then I'll have all kinds of reasons why I can't give you that $1 million, because you've not demonstrated to me that your cat can fetch. Your cat, what your cat really isn't doing is fetching. And you can play these games all day, and especially to have a magician run this game. That to me is just pure hilarity. When you've got things like Craig Keener, his 2-volume book on miracles. It's a very interesting book. So
yeah, but they can't even explain how a tree grows. So doesn't that kind of violate the laws of whatever physics or whatever as we understand it? We don't even know how life is animated. It's crazy.
Yeah, well, that's part of the mysteries. And what is the James Tour, who's out there? He's a very successful scientist who basically says that everyone who says they have any idea how the building blocks of life were formed by some volcanic soup is just simply full of it. They can't even reproduce it in a lab, and they're trying to reverse engineer it. So James Tour is fun to listen to too, and he's kind of snarky, and that's just what's out there. Speaking of Chad the alcoholic, he has the next question. What's your symbolic estuary animal? I don't know. Someone is sending me a Peugeot doll. So the animal kingdom is growing here. With these kinds of things, I usually find it best to have someone else assign me an animal and or assign me a meme. We don't see ourselves well enough to really memeify ourselves very well, and so that's where the internet is fun, and y'all can meme me, and I'll learn from those memes. So, but yeah, we have Kermit, we have Jordan, of course, we have Sam, who's the count, and we have Joe Rogan, who's the monkey. So that's
you're a golden retriever.
I'm a golden retriever.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see. We'll see if that meme survives. All right. Let's see. James Lee. Well, that's not really a question. All right. Paul from the first day of May. I watched today's PVK video, 2 atheists challenge 2 clergy on what the church needs to do to learn from Jordan Peterson. That, Mark, I wasn't quite sure the way that whole conversation was going to go. Mark sort of set that up with Mark and Joey and Father Eric and I, and that conversation went really well. And that conversation performed a lot better in terms of analytics than I expected it to. So well done, Mark. Jordan Peterson has different hermeneutics, biblical interpretation methods, and communication styles compared to the average preacher. Yes, he does. Because he's not in the tradition that most of us are. We get our jobs within a tradition. And there are rules and limitations and all those kinds of things. So that's a good point. These helped him connect to modern audiences that mainstream Christianity had not connected with. How can preachers use innovative interpretation and communication techniques with considerations to doctrine, church denomination constraints? Well, that's exactly it. There's a funny dynamic in this too, where Jordan's head is back. It's hard to get Sam and Jordan and Joe sort of all looking good because now poor Jordan is kind of slouching. There's an interesting dynamic on the internet and within a secular culture that once someone is sort of outed as a Christian, they will lose status. And especially since the 1990s at the end of the Cold War. What's his name? The masculinist. He talks about positive, neutral, and negative. Aaron Wren. Positive, neutral, and negative in terms of the relationship between Christianity and the culture in North America. During the Cold War, if you wanted, and this is uneven, it's still true in some zip codes and not true in other zip codes. For example, if you watch the Andy Griffith Show, Andy went to church. Andy and Aunt B and Opie, they all went to church. Going to church at that point in America was what you did if you were an upstanding Christian man. And part of what FDR did was sort of broaden it so that, if you were an upstanding Christian man and you were a Jew, you went to synagogue. Or if you were a Catholic, you went to the Catholic Church. And so suddenly it was respectable after the Second World War to be a Protestant or a Catholic or a Jew and to go to your church and to identify as a Christian and to say all of those things that Christians or Jews or Catholics say. And the Hollywood movies that's when you had The Greatest Story Ever Told, Ben-Hur, the Robe, all of these big blockbuster Hollywood movies that sort of presented, we are a Judeo-Christian civilization standing against godless communism, blah, 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 blah. The end of the Cold War, things sort of took on a neutral valence for a while. And then, especially with the woke stuff, Christianity took on a negative valence. And Aaron Wren, using Tim Keller, has quite nicely showed how in the neutral worldview, Tim Keller's evangelistic method was quite effective, and it is less effective in the negative, where being a Christian is now problematic, and it's problematic among a variety of different groups. It's problematic with the woke because Christianity is all about legacies of white supremacy and heteronormity and patriarchy and all those things. So if you go to a church, you're probably going to have to explain exactly what kind of church you're going to. Make sure it has all the proper flags waving outside. And so there's all of these things going on, which means that part of, and this has been said many, many times, part of Jordan Peterson's appeal Adam Friended has said this very clearly. Part of Jordan Peterson's appeal is that he sticks to the modernist side of the line overtly. And even Rationality Rules in his video that I've played a clip of many, many times. Is Jordan Peterson a Jesus smuggler? No. But he brings people right up to the line and they step over themselves. He's sort of like the guy who's on, you know, you're trying to climb up the mountain. He grabs you, he brings you to the top, and he hands you off to those on the other side of the mountain. That'd be me and Peugeot, and say, welcome to the church. But he stays just handing people up. And even in the Freddie and Paul show this past week, Nancy Schuler commenting, because I've mentioned Jordan and Michaela and Tammy in my sermons recently. And so Nancy's commenting on Jordan Peterson. He's riding the fence, which I thought was hilarious. So Jordan doing what he's doing, where he's doing it, has been effective for some very real reasons. And there's lots of different aspects to this. The fact that he's sort of had become a conservative, whereas before he was much more of a moderate Canadian in terms of politics. And I mean, there's lots of reasons for this. And part of it is just Peterson's charisma, the timing. One of the interesting things about the second wave has been, and some people have pointed this out to me, Peterson's stock has continued to rise, but quietly now. His YouTube channel continues to grow. And whereas there very much is sort of among many of us, Jordan Peterson is sort of map territory, he continues to gain new people who just discover him. One person, for example, who used to go to my church, I baptized him and his kids, and eventually went to some much more storefronty Pentecostally churches. I mean, he loves Pastor Furtick now, which just kind of surprises me, because me and Furtick, not exactly the same kinds of preachers. But he recently found Jordan Peterson, and then he sent me a voicemail and said, "Oh, that Jordan Peterson guy, he's interesting." I thought, yeah, he's finding him. A lot of us were early adopters, and there's a much bigger wave that's probably growing right now. All that being said, someone like Steve Furtick, Elevation Church, Mega Church, I mean, lots of people here have plenty of critiques of him. These are not small movements. Look at their YouTube metrics. One of the things that Rick and I have done sometimes when we set up Sunday morning live stream is there's a Gino, what's his last name, Rick? Pastor Gino of such and such a church somewhere. He's a black pastor. He's not Trinitarian. He's just got kind of a traditional black church there. The men sit on one side, the women sit on the other side. They do wear masks. He's kind of a read-on preacher where he's got a guy sitting next to him who reads, and he just makes comments as he goes. He's tremendously entertaining. He's tremendously charismatic. You know, big numbers on YouTube. Nobody pays any attention to him in the New York Times. It's sort of the way that they just don't put the Bible on the New York Times bestseller list because it would always be number one. And there are huge Christian movements out there that we pay no attention to because they're Christian. And once you sort of get slotted in a Christian lane, a lot of mainstream media will just shove you to the side. Now, if you start to dabble in politics, then they, depending especially on the side of the politics you're on. If you're in the New York Times, you're really annoyed at Jerry Falwell and the religious right, but Reverend Jesse Jackson, well, he's just continuing the legacy. So there's a lot of complexity to this that isn't immediately apparent to a lot of people. The amazing thing about Peterson was this transitional aspect where he, so here's another name that I'll throw out just because I used to, every now and then I'd turn on PBS and there was Wayne Dyer. Who's Wayne Dyer? Wayne Dyer is kind of a more of a new age-ish kind of guy. And, he'd have these big shows on PBS. Along the line, Sam often brings up the American transcendentalists, and Sam's got a real point there. That the tradition of transcendentalism is deep in America. And so people often look at this new age stuff and say, oh, that's all imported from the Far East, yada, yada, yada. Well, I was here with the transcendentalists too. And a lot of those ideas have been around a long time. And so a guy like Wayne Dyer, very popular guy, sold a lot of books, was even on PBS, but won't get a lot of attention necessarily. But then they always sort of pass, and I see a lot of people doing this. Christianity tried it, but it was never convincing. When they say things like, Jesus is a relationship and not a religion. That's kind of a neat evangelical turn of phrase, but nobody's buying it. Because, by the way, secularism lays itself out. Everybody understands Christianity is a religion by definition of what a religion is in a secular society. But there's a lot of other things which are sort of gray areas. And probably one of the most popular, yoga is a big one. If you go to a yoga studio, someone would come and say, are you promoting a religion? No, this isn't a religion. This isn't a religion at all. This is a new way. And there are lots of things. The Secret. There's all sorts of things like that. And someone, usually an evangelical, will say, that's a religion. No, we're not a religion. We're just trying to open your life to a whole new way of thinking. Sounds like a religion to me. But once you get tagged with that religion label, well, then you're sort of put in a lane and put in a box. And Peterson, what Peterson's done is really quite amazing. And Peterson's just a really interesting guy. He's a very interesting guy, fun to listen to. And he had a very, he was someone who was at home in the academy, had academic chops, taught at Harvard, U of T, all kinds of research papers. He was a Jungian who was actually open about his ideas about Jung. He was a kind of he was a synthetic thinker who would bring a lot of things together, who was broadly read. He wasn't afraid to talk about ideas that, a lot of academics are very careful, and rightly so. And they want to sort of stick to their lane, and they want to be very careful about what they say. Peterson, a little easier on the trigger there sometimes. And, that comes up when now he's doing these conversations like the one this week with someone, a primatologist. And Peterson said, well, isn't this true? And he made a point that he's made in lots and lots of videos. And the guy kind of walked it back. And Jordan's not afraid of that. And I don't find Jordan's sort of light on the, with a light trigger about these things necessarily problematic. It means that he'll get some things wrong, but he's also humble enough to stand corrected. And when he does get corrected, he will update his talks as he goes. That's sort of the sign of an honest man, instead of say doubling down on the misinformation that he had before, or the mistaken aspect of it. So Jordan was just a different class, but that's a good thing. But don't forget that there are, in this little corner of the internet, a lot of time people don't realize how massive the Christian world is, how many successful preachers there are out there. We have a in real life politic. Great stream. Thank you. So yeah, a lot of good preachers out there. Jordan's by no means, the world is a wild place. Isn't that great? All right, Gunnar. Hi, Paul. Have you ever read or studied presuppositional apologetics? The apologetics of Van Til and Banson. Not really. I know, Van Til is originally from, he's a Dutch Calvinist, and how to talk about this. So Old Princeton, And when they say old Princeton, they mean before Princeton went modernist. This is the fundamentalist modernist fight. The refugees of old Princeton founded Westminster, Philadelphia. And they were close enough to the Dutch Calvinists, the neo-Calvinist tradition of Kuyper and Bavinck, that Ned Stonehouse, my missions professor at Calvin Seminary, father of a friend of mine, Roger Greenway taught at Westminster, Tim Keller taught at Westminster, Van Til taught at Westminster. So Westminster sort of became Presbyterian crossover between Dutch Calvinism and conservative Presbyterianism in America. And there's Westminster, Philadelphia, and Westminster, Southern California, and they have their own traditions. But, excuse me, Calvin Seminary. So what happens with these little confessional enclaves is that they take on different things. And so Westminster and Van Til, really sort of went hard into the overtly presuppositionalist stuff. There's a lot of presuppositionalism in what has developed in me, but it's sort of like, an earlier strain, a common ancestor. And one of the lines is Van Til, and one of the lines is sort of Calvin Seminary and the nuances of its approaches through Anthony Hoekema and Bas van Elderen and John Steck and all of the people who sort of formed the Calvin Seminary that I attended in the late 80s. So, but I've never, for me, often to study a lot of that stuff is sort of boring because it's sort of an intensification of our common ancestor. And so it's kind of like, yeah, definitely presuppositions are really guiding things. And so often what happens when people listen to me, they hear that common ancestor between Calvin Seminary and Cornelius Van Til. I say, oh, Paul must be a presuppositionalist, but I've not really been schooled in Van Tilian presuppositionalism. Where was I? If so, what do you think about it? And what do you think it's useful to engage in scientism and other ideological views saturating the social consciousness nowadays? I think presuppositionalism is fundamentally right. And even in the Brett Weinstein conversation with Peugeot, I think Weinstein and I think then presupposition, the common ancestor of presuppositionalism beneath Calvin Seminary and Cornelius Van Til was correct in that you can't just start thinking from no place. You have to. It's in some ways an early theological expression of the frame problem. In order to see anything, you need to assume something. There needs to be a value hierarchy. There need to be certain assumptions in order to operate in the world. Now, we didn't talk about the fact that the world is too massive for us to digest, and therefore there's a filter which is created by our values. All that stuff I learned later in listening to Peterson and Peugeot and Vervaeke. But I think those kinds of ideas are built into presuppositionalism, but in a theological form and not in a cognitive science form. All right. Deep Dark Seas, John. I felt a little haunted recently when listening to Peugeot and Paul Kingsnorth talk about the machine technological babble. I'm working in machine learning and artificial intelligence, which is the spearhead of the machine and might be the culmination of the technological babble in that it often aims to surpass human consciousness with a proverbial tower of silicon and code. I have traditionally believed that technology in itself is a value-neutral tool and is just and it's just how you use it that matters. Machine learning can be used to invade people's privacy, but also to detect cancer earlier than any human doctor could. I get the sense from Peugeot and Kingsnorth that Christians must at some point draw a line in the sand and say no further to certain technology that inevitably perpetuates the machine. Are we hitting a point where certain technology is in itself bad? More practically, how can I and other Christians working in the tech industry be proud of our work and confident that it forwards the kingdom of God and not the kingdom of this world? So I want to get to this in my treatment of Peugeot in that whole group of videos that came out before Holy Week. And when I thought about it, I decided to do the Weinstein video first before getting into this issue. I think Kingsnorth is right in that there needs to be limits. I don't think the limits are sort of an on-off thing. And the reason for that, and Peugeot has in some ways convinced me of that, because what Peugeot sort of clued me into, and this comes through in his Enoch video, is the theme of technology in the Bible. And it begins with Cain and the ancestors of Cain. Now, you've often heard me talk about the antithetical. See, in Kuyper, it's antithesis and common grace. That's not a bad formulation. I don't really have yet the name for the second part of it. I want to say binary and analog, but that doesn't quite get at it either. But it's the antithesis and it's common grace. Antithesis thinking is black and white thinking. And I know black and white thinking in some groups gets a hard time, but it shouldn't. We all need black and white thinking. It's not really black and white thinking with respect to these cookies. See how much these cookies come up? They're sitting in front of me, and something deep inside of me says, cookie. Maybe Rick is like, yeah, Rick and I are going to have cookies after. Maybe Andrea, I'm not a golden retriever. Maybe I'm the cookie monster. I'm distracted by the cookies. I put my hat over them. We need both antithesis and common grace. And I got to be really careful here because there's a lot of stuff I can talk about without having to sort of tiptoe over confessional tripwires. But actually, when we get into infra and supralapsarianism and Irenaeus, not too long ago, a couple of Calvin professors lost their jobs because they delved a little bit too deep into Irenaeus and got into some supralapsarian thinking, and Calvin basically called them on a violation for the Heidelberg Catechism. It's not that CRC confessionalists never patrol their boundaries. So,
Paul, can I ask you a question before you go on?
of course, Andrea.
Can you, for those of us who have maybe forgotten, what does supralapsarianism mean?
Yes, I agree. I was just going to ask that.
So infralapsarianism versus supralapsarianism was a debate in the middle of the 20th century among neo-Calvinists that basically asked the question, was the fall really part of God's plan all along? The infralapsarians say no. The supralapsarians say yes. Now, that's kind of a distilled way of getting to it, but in a lot of ways, that's kind of where the question hinges on. And I remember my father talking about it. And so in neo-Calvinist circles, what it got into is the order of the decrees in the mind of God before the foundations of the earth. So that gets deep into ideas of divine election and all these kind of things. And that tends to be how theology works. But I remember my father commenting on this because that was a big topic, I think, when he was in seminary in the late 50s. And he said, we're fighting over sequence of God's ideas that are by no means in the Bible. You know, how this is highly speculative. And so these kinds of debates, although they can be fun and maybe they have some importance, we ought to be a bit careful of. But, you know, when Peugeot talks about the fact that Adam and Eve take the, you know, when he basically says, you know, it wasn't that Adam and Eve taking the fruit got the timing wrong. They rushed in and grabbed what they should have waited for. That's a really attractive idea because it sort of answers a question too, which a lot of people has asked. Well, why would God put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden anyway? And that's kind of an attractive answer. But now that also sets you down a road thinking about human improvement. And human improvement is very much a part of Christian progressive theology. And I don't mean that progressive in terms of in terms of a theological class, but ideas of theosis are fundamentally progressive because humans are progressing towards godlikeness. And, you know, everybody's, you know, by virtue of, you know, the current hotness that orthodoxy is now. Oh, wow, theosis, that's awesome. Okay. It is. And we ought to grow in godliness and maybe in godlikeness. And there certainly are some very tantalizing passages in the book of Colossians. But this, how to really think about this stuff in a good way is sort of difficult. But then Peugeot makes the observation, and I think he's right, that when the story begins in a garden and ends in a city, cities are full of technology. Cities are the product of Cain. And this gets into miracles because it's sort of a miracle that God can take our fallenness and achieve greater glory from it than it seems could be had in other ways, perhaps. There's a sense of when you do this kind of theology and you think along these kinds of lines, there's a real moral hazard in it because we get above and beyond ourselves. Because we start to develop theodicies, we start to develop ideas of why God is doing what God is doing. And to a certain degree, those kinds of ideas are unavoidable, but we always have to be very careful of them because we don't know the mind of God. Should we speculate on the order of these Calvinistic decrees before the foundations of the earth? Should we presume to know what God was doing when he sets things up? That's a pretty big presumption because I don't know what God is doing in all sorts of things in my life, including me talking on the internet right now. So there's a sense of when David, the psalmist, says, these things are too mysterious for me. And that's a part of human humility that we should always cherish, that let God be God. And every time we sort of slip onto his throne, we are playing the devil's game. So I don't, this stuff is so hard. And the reason it's so hard, how can I give you a sense of why it's so hard? Because it's too vast to know. So Brett Weinstein likes to say things like, if the Bible didn't need updating, why wouldn't there be a commandment not to split the atom and put the whole world in jeopardy by virtue of nuclear weapons? Fair comment. One might even say, why isn't there a commandment against the internal combustion engine and put vast amounts of carbon, release vast amounts of carbon from coal, or why not burn coal, or why, so I don't tend to think, John, that the way forward means we just stop in certain areas. The problem is we don't know when to stop. And so when Peterson makes a point of, crossing smallpox with Ebola in a lab, probably not the best thing to do. And let's say maybe continuing on to say, those hydrogen bombs that we made of many, many megatons, far more powerful than the Hiroshima or Nagasaki bomb. Maybe it's not a good idea to just see how many megaton, how huge a yield we can make from nuclear explosions. Yeah, and I think in some ways we've sort of, even bomb makers realize that there is a bomb too big to be practical for even the most grossly, diabolically ambitious schemes of winning a nuclear war. Yeah, I get that. But I don't know. And so when I listen to Kingsnorth, part of me really agrees with him, but another part of me says, so there was a Star Trek episode in which, the Star Trek discovered this civilization that seems to be living like a bunch of hippies. They're doing organic farming and they're living in peace and they don't have weapons. And of course, because of the Prime Directive, all the Federation people are sort of spying on them. And then of course, oops, something happened, and oh yeah, we're spacemen and we have laser guns and we have all these things. And the end of the show is basically all the hippies say, oh yeah, we've had all those things, but we decide to live on the farm and work with our hands and love each other and have simple families and yada yada yada, and episode over. And it's a fun little thought experiment. And maybe, there's lots of technologies that we have sort of abandoned because it's like, yeah, we just don't want to go there. It's really difficult with weapons systems because we sort of like to go there. And we're afraid that someone else is going to go there, so we'd better build it ourselves. And this question of nuclear proliferation is a really dangerous one, because if there's anything we've learned from North Korea and the Ukraine, it's like, if the Ukraine had kept their nukes, would they be having this war? But then again, do we really want every little country in the world having their own nukes? If Russia would decide to invade France, would France nuke Russia? Maybe France would say, well, maybe if we had more nukes, then Russia wouldn't invade. I mean, so, John, I have to think a lot more about this. And I very much want you to think a lot about this. And these are things that we as communities should be thinking about and praying about and having far more conversations. And I think the conversations are really helped by people like Michael Martin, his biodynamic farm over there in West Michigan, and Paul Kingsnorth, and some people out there who are deeply, deeply skeptical about the machine. We need their voices, because the way we work is that we have all of these ideas out there and they have to be tested. And so it's a healthy thing to have diversity of ideas and to talk and to challenge. That's one of the good things that liberalism gave us. And the same thing, it's not just technology as such that we think about in terms of chemistry or biology or electronics or something like that. It also has to do with ideas. And so, right now there's a real testing of liberalism. Benjamin Boyce had a very interesting conversation with a Roman Catholic and, sort of throwing liberalism under the bus. And hey, I think liberalism should be taken down a few pegs, but liberalism has also given us some really cool things. And so actually in that whole spectrum of conversation that Peugeot had, where he's talking to Brett Weinstein and James Lindsay, these are modernists. They are, especially James Lindsay, he's a classical liberal. So is Jordan Peterson. And this is why I'm not going to join the chorus of Catholic and Orthodox saying, oh, I wish we could have avoided the Enlightenment and the Protestant Reformation. Oh, it was the start of all kinds of horrible things. Oh, yeah, it was. But I also don't know that it could have been avoided. And I don't know that we could have actually avoided neither nuclear power, nor nuclear medicine, nor nuclear weapons. Now we're going to have to live with them. And it would be nice to say, oh, I wish we had avoided nuclear weapons. But, we did Dresden and a lot of cities in Germany pretty thoroughly without nukes. And I'm sure we will develop many more weapons that are, I was thinking the other day, these aren't weapons of mass destruction so much as weapons of mass attention. Because chemical weapons, I mean, the battlefield utility of chemical weapons has long been suspect. They didn't really turn the tide of the First World War as much as sort of horrify us. These are weapons of mass attention. So, John, this is a great question, and I will trust scientists like you who are Christians, who are listening to King's North to think these things through. And, before there was King's North, as Nate Heil pointed out, there was Jacques Ellul. We have to keep asking these questions, and we need people like King's North to, kind of be the Lorax. I speak for the trees. And we have to process these things together. But the end of the story in the Bible is the city of God. It's not, oh, back to the garden and chop that snake's head off. No. So God seems to have a plan for us. And it seems to involve, well, the cultural mandate, as my Reformed theological teachers taught me, is to fulfill the earth. And part of that fulfillment is technology. So it's a great question. All right. Was Jesus a troll? I'd say no. But he certainly knew how to set traps for people. Is the Heavenly Father who feeds the ravens, clothes the lilies, and numbers the hairs on our head truly giving him an easy job there, Paul? God number one and number two. Remember, those are boxes for me. So that's very arenic. It's very much like the arena. And so I'd say more number one. One of the defining things about Protestantism has been our rejection or compulsion against the worship of Mary, the Mother of God. As I understand it, Catholics and Orthodox see a major part of her role as an embodiment of the feminine ideal. I wonder about our culture's struggle with gender roles and identity, a very hot topic in Protestant churches, women pastors, complementarians, and whether the iconoclasm of the feminine ideal has had a part to play in this particular part of our cultural narrative. Would love to know whether you see this as being the case and whether you think that there are things Protestants can do to recover an orientation towards the feminine idea. Do we need to have a reckoning with Mary, or is there another way forward? Well, maybe Mary's going to have a reckoning with us. I think there's something to this. But, it's very interesting that on one hand, theology around Mary is on one hand very old, but also, at least in the Roman Catholic Church, I don't know this, I don't know much Orthodox Church history. It's in the modern period that a lot of, as Protestants would call, Mariolatry became intensified, which means that it was something on the minds of both Protestants and Catholics, partly because the Industrial Revolution very much changed gender roles. Throughout much of human history, the sexual dimorphism, I can thank the Dark Host podcast for teaching me all these fancy biological terms. Sexual dimorphism, which has men being larger and stronger, was an important part of gender roles throughout much of human history. When a lot of what had to get done by man or animal muscle power, men were going to do things that women couldn't. The Industrial Revolution comes on, and suddenly you have steam and water, and we're harnessing, and fossil fuels, we're harnessing all sorts of other power, thus making this impressive body that I have. I expect people to laugh. This impressive body that I have now moot. Women can work in factories, children can work in factories. Suddenly, the difference of the physiological difference between men and women with respect to muscle power no longer means what it does at scale. And so, when Rod made his comment about what men and women can do, he drew some sharp comments in the YouTube comment section there. But and of course, he's making a point. There are many things that men can do better than women today, yet by virtue of our musculature. We're not going to see a lot of trans men competing in the NBA or the NFL. It's not going to happen. Maybe a kicker? I don't know. Probably not even there either. So Rod was making a point. But yet it's not the case that the differences that we had before, things have changed. And that has impacted how men and women get together. Birth control has impacted it. All kinds of things have impacted it. So again, sort of like in the Paul Kingsnorth thing, I'm grateful for Catholic theology of the body. I'm grateful for what I've learned from many of you Roman Catholics. And, it's so funny because, nobody can get on me faster or sharper than Mary Cohen. I mean, I say something wrong, and if she's feeling well enough to listen to my videos, I've got to text her an email and, Paul, I want to come on your channel and set you straight about some things. And I love it, Mary, bring it on. And I've, she set me straight about a lot of things over the years. And, she's just giving me Catholic teaching that she has learned. But here's a woman teaching a man. So that's true too. So, because, in terms of our intellectual power, there might be some areas in which we differ. But as Peterson and Vervaeke said, I mean, we're mostly alike. Why do men succeed at math and chess in greater number than women? I have no idea. There's probably a reason for it, but I don't know what it is. Women succeed in other things. Is it interest? Is it, doesn't matter. So Protestantism, I think, has been a way for the overall church to deal with rapid change. And I think I think this is going to sound strange. I think, frankly, Protestantism is a good thing for the Orthodox and the Catholics. Because just like Jordan Peterson says, we have ideas, so our ideas can die instead of us. Well, maybe we have Protestant churches, so Protestant churches can die instead of Catholic and Orthodox. So Protestantism is sort of the experimental wing of the church. And if you're a Protestant, I suppose we've been signed up as guinea pigs. And at the same time, Catholics and Orthodox, now they're keeping an eye on the Protestants, and they'll freely borrow or steal from Protestants when they think the Protestants have a good idea that fits their tradition. And Protestants will do the same from Catholic and Orthodox. And I think figuring out how Mary fits into Christian theology is part of that. And part of the reason that Mary isn't such a big part of the Protestant world is that there's not a lot about her in the Bible. And this line that Protestants drew, I know, I say sola scriptura and someone's going to go off. The Protestants drew that line for a reason. And it was sort of a disciplining reason. We're gonna just try to stick to this. And not a lot of Mary in the Bible. So, but I think as the Protestant Reformation plays itself out, just like Donatism did, just like many things did, so the Donatist controversy, that was trying to deal with what happened in Roman persecution. Should the Catholic Church just let in any priest who, out of expedience denied the name of Christ to save his skin? No. The Donatists had a point. Do you need a hard, fast line so that no one who did that will ever be let in? No, it's probably not a good way either. And it's in this way that over long periods of time, the Holy Spirit works in the church. And the thing is, Protestant Reformation, that's only 500 years ago. Church is 2,000 years old. And if you add the Jewish tradition, even longer. So we're just living in it. So yeah, I think if you look at, say, someone like Scott McKnight, he wrote a lovely book on Mary. So I think this will continue. But there's a lot of factors going on in terms of the male-female stuff. So, all right, Christian Golden. In what ways might it be beneficial to consider fear of God as fear of his absence? Well, you ask interesting questions, Christian. You're a pretty creative guy. You ask very creative questions. It seems to me that those of us in modern developed societies lack a fear of his absence. Perhaps because we lack awareness of his presence. We fail to recognize his presence around us as the primary force underneath and through and above the miracle of society, which we think we've done in and of ourselves. Yeah, I think it's a great point. We probably don't fear hell enough because we don't feel fear his absence, and it's what hell is. So it's a great question. The Republicans are optimistic about controlling the Senate and the House. Ooh, look, a political question. Big deal. Facebook, Twitter are the top information centers and are controlled by a narrative clearly against scriptures. What are your thoughts on this? The Bible has a very interesting idea about control. Because on one hand, Satan brings Jesus to the top of the mountain and says, all of these kingdoms I control. Bow the knee to me and I'll give them all to you. But by bowing, what Jesus would really give into is the spirit that in some ways makes all those kingdoms work. And what Jesus does on the cross changes that. And when he ascends, he becomes Lord and rules over heaven and earth. And yet the nations are still sort of doing what they're doing, and yet Jesus is infiltrating. And I don't know that either the social media or the kingdom of the United States is, they're very much in play in terms of both the kingdom that the devil speaks of to Jesus and the resurrected, ascended Lord who reigns over heaven and earth. And this is where, again, the antithesis, because you could say Twitter is of the devil. Yeah, kind of. So maybe Christians shouldn't be on Twitter. Well, what about television? Well, what about the automobile? Well, what about anything produced by fixed nitrogen, synthetic agriculture? I'm not going to eat anything that's produced by anything that has a synthetic fertilizer. Oh, okay. It's the same problem as technology. So Republicans, one of the interesting things that I've been thinking about is this whole monarchy question after listening to Yarvin and Peugeot and Kings North. That's another thing I want to come back to, is this question of monarchy. And because on one hand, monarchy sounds just like crazy land, but then, oh, wait a minute. England still is a monarchy. So is the Netherlands. I don't know. I hope, if we're going to have a two-party system, I hope that power changes hands peacefully and regularly and often in our country. I live in a state where we effectively have one-party rule. I think California would be a healthier place if the Republicans were a little stronger. There's probably places in the United States that would be a healthier place if the Democrats were a little stronger. So, as my Mormon friend would always say, quoting me from the Book of Mormon, there must be opposition in all things. So, I think it's good for the Democrats that the Republicans win. And I think it's good for the Republicans that the Democrats win. But it's all a mess. So, those are my thoughts. Oh, it's 1:00. Let's see. How many questions? We're making progress, Rick. He laughs. So many people around me think I'm hopeless. Paul's hopeless. This is a pastoral question. I'll end with this one. Let me put a reply so I know where I am. Hi, Paul. I was wondering if you could give some advice on prayer. There's a topic I can't manage to pray about in earnest because my heart is divided on it. Each time I try, it feels like the connection is broken and I'm suddenly talking to myself rather than praying. I find it difficult to discern whether this is due to unbelief on my part, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief, or to reluctance, Lord, please convert me, but not yet. Or if this is God's no I'm experiencing and I should stop praying about it. Have you ever experienced something similar? And if so, how do you handle it? I don't think that something like this can be handled in abstract. I think you need someone that you trust who can keep confidence that you can lay this out all with and work through the question. I think it's a great question, but there's so much nuance and so many things that this is why we need the church. This is why we need, Jesus says, where there are 2 or 3 gathered in my name, I am there. He doesn't say, whenever you're alone with your eyes closed, trying really hard to connect with me, I am there. I'm not saying he isn't, but there's something about the 2 or 3 and more. So I would say, find someone or take this to someone that is a Christian that you respect and trust. It could be a priest or a pastor or an elder or a friend or a parent or someone that you trust and that you can confide in and lay it out. And then maybe number one, you don't have to pray alone about it, because if they pray with you about it, then you might learn something else. So there's my answer. All right. Hey, we've caught up to questions that were asked today, and we didn't answer a single one of them. So there we have it. Anybody have anything they want to say in the voice chat room?
Always fun.
We should,
listening to
I see
you.
Catherine's in the room. The Thunder Bay Conference planning is underway. And, you know, I believe it's going to happen this September. You want to say anything about it, Catherine? One of the really exciting things about it, so it's going to be a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. You know what we're going to do Thursday? Paintball for Jesus out in Western Ontario. Paintball for Jesus. Grim Grizz's vision is coming true. So we're going to paintball for Jesus. I'm going to be there, Lord willing. Peugeot, Vervaeke, another local professor. We're going to talk about consciousness. I am so looking forward to that. Also, we're going to have a Chicago event coming up, and I'm going to do a live event with Esther O'Reilly, also known as Bethel McGrew. I'm going to do a Grand Rapids Estuary event on the Friday after CRC Synod. So if you're traveling to Grand Rapids to Synod, make sure that your plans to leave Friday later in the day. Vendonk and I are doing that event. So I'm going to get together with the Grand Rapids meetup. Lots of fun stuff coming. Catherine, did you want to say something?
Yeah, thanks. Took me a second to get my earbuds turned on, but yeah, the conference is really designed around trying to have conversations and trying to give room for everybody to interact with the speakers with one another, having dyads and larger groups. So it's really dependent on the idea of all the fun stuff at a conference that you want to do. Like, you want to listen in when people are talking to the conference speaker and when they talk to each other behind the scenes and all of that. And we're trying to pull that up to the foreground so that you're participating as much as possible. So I really think it's going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to be much richer if we have more people who are already engaged in the conversation who are there. So I would benefit if you all came and made it a richer experience for everybody. And I'm really excited about it. So thanks for letting me say something, Paul.
Yeah. And part of the reason that I'm doing it here is I know Catherine's nervous. You know, are we going to fill up? I think we will. And so when they're talking about early bird registration. When the registration goes out, get it fast. I think it's going to fill up. I think, I don't know how many they're going to have, room for like 250 or something like that. I think they're all going to go, because when you think of the people that are interested in Vervaeke's work, the people that follow my work, the people that follow Peugeot's work, this is the first time the three of us are going to be together physically. I think I'm so looking forward to it. And the fact that she planned paintball at the beginning of it, that's just too much fun. Paintball and barbecue. So it's going to be great. It's going to be great. September 2022.
16 to 18.
What's that?
September 16 to 18.
September 16 to 18, Thunder Bay, Ontario. So that's going to be it. Start saving your pennies for your plane ticket. Catherine said getting me there is a little difficult. So we might, I might spend a day or two in Toronto on the way there. Just because I'm probably going to have to spend the night in Toronto. So why not spend a little extra time? But Thunder Bay is definitely where you're going to want to be on those days. So there we have it. Rick, and transmission.